Canada and the U.S. are once again talking trade after Ottawa pulled the digital services tax, but
America is not prepared for this disaster. While the nation's attention is focused on elections, technology, and international conflicts, behind the scenes an unprecedented economic blow is unfolding at the very heart of the United States to those who feed the nation every day. A decision made abroad, just a few miles from our northern border, has already turned 7 major agricultural states into an economic disaster zone. And this is only the beginning.
It's not the only irritant for Donald Trump. Canada's supply management system has been criticized for years.
A law that Canada passed quickly and almost without fanfare has, in just a few weeks, caused destruction unseen even in times of global economic crisis. We are talking about Bill C-202, a new law aimed at protecting the Canadian food market. But behind the Canadian facade of import restrictions lies a powerful blow to U.S. exports, to billions of dollars, to the lives of millions of Americans.
Well, it looks like it is. In fact, of course, if you look back at what the US has been doing for quite some time, they have been becoming more and more protectionist, and different presidents as well. So it's not just Trump, although now it has accelerated.
While Washington discusses abstract budget figures, in Wisconsin, thousands of liters of milk are simply being poured onto the ground. In Minnesota, corn and soybeans are rotting in warehouses without a single buyer. In Iowa, farmers are selling off their equipment to pay off debts. In California, processing plants are closing one after another. This is not just a crisis. It is a systemic collapse caused by a single foreign policy amendment in a neighboring country. But who is behind it? Why did Canada suddenly change the rules of the game, and why is New Zealand benefiting from it? How did the United States, one of the world's leaders in agriculture, end up blocked on its own continent? This is not just a question of trade. It is a question of survival.
And actually, the response on the markets has not been as severe as many people had predicted. After the initial kind of, calamitous falls of the stock markets and the rise in the bond markets, things seem to have calmed down, and now the stock market in the US certainly is booming.
Farmers across the country are sounding the alarm. People whose families have grown food for millions of Americans for generations are now standing with placards outside the Capitol, demanding urgent help that is still not forthcoming. They are losing everything from contracts and jobs to hope for the future. And while politicians argue about priorities, in the heartland the countdown is already underway. How many weeks until complete bankruptcy? This crisis is a mirror in which we see how vulnerable we are to global decisions made not in Washington or even Brussels, but in Ottawa. One law and the whole system collapses. One signed document and the world's largest economy finds itself in a food trap.
It's a great question, Matt, and Canada is trying to figure out the answer. One of the things we need to understand about tariffs, however, is that they're not just an economic weapon.
In this episode, we'll tell you what exactly happened, why Canada's decision was a disaster for American farmers, and most importantly, whether the US will be able to weather this storm. Or will 2025 go down in history as the beginning of the end of America's agricultural power? Stay with us, it's only going to get more intense. In early 2025, Canada made a decision that many at the time perceived as a purely domestic initiative. However, within weeks it became clear that the new law Bill C-202 was not just an amendment to trade legislation. It was a step that could redefine the entire architecture of North American agriculture. The law was presented as a measure to strengthen the Canadian supply management system, ostensibly to protect local producers from the volatility of global markets and dependence on imports. But behind this wording lay a much tougher mechanism, a legislative ban on the import of a whole range of strategically important agricultural products from the US. The first to suffer were dairy products, grains, meat, corn, and soybeans, the very items that had ensured food cooperation between the two countries for decades.
Amazing what's happened. That's also the view on Wall Street, but in a very different way. The president not acknowledging the
American response was immediate. But, as is often the case in large bureaucratic systems, it was too late. By the time the first official statements came out of Washington, contracts worth more than $9.4 billion had already been cancelled, and tens of thousands of tons of products had been frozen, redirected to the domestic market, or simply destroyed. In the first 2 weeks after the law came into force, more than 400 of the 1,300 dairy farms that supplied Canada ceased production. At the same time, record volumes of unsold grain began to accumulate in warehouses in Minnesota, Iowa, and Wisconsin. Minnesota alone reported more than 120,000 tons of soybeans awaiting shipment, but stuck in limbo.
Well, at this point, there's no there are ongoing discussions, but there's no ongoing negotiation.
Farmers accustomed to working long hours and planning harvests for seasons ahead found themselves trapped. International contracts were broken without compensation, cooperatives faced the need for emergency reprofiling, and loans taken out for future deliveries turned into a debt trap. In Wisconsin, 73 processing plants suspended operations in a single month, and the price of milk fell by almost 28%. The domestic market became oversaturated, distributors couldn't cope with logistics, and supermarkets began offering discounts of up to 50% on fresh produce, not for marketing purposes, but to sell the goods before their expiration dates.
The most in demand and the hardest ones to replace from the US is typically berries, citrus, and greens, lettuce.
If there is produce from the US and produce from Canada, and they're the same, of course, I'll go Canadian, of course.
The problem took on not only an economic, but also a social dimension. Farmers' protests began in many regions. In New York, about 2,000 farmers gathered outside the state capitol, demanding that a state of agricultural emergency be declared. In Michigan, trucks appeared on the highways with signs reading, "Canada closed the border, Washington closed its eyes." One of the most emotional scenes unfolded in the small town of Middleton, Wisconsin, where a farming family that had owned a dairy farm for 4 generations publicly poured 20,000 liters of milk on the side of the road in protest and despair.
And you hear it anecdotally, either Canadians staying in Canada for vacation or going to somewhere else like Europe.
But the real problem was deeper than just exports. The new reality exposed a shocking truth. The US was critically dependent on foreign markets for the sale of certain categories of product. Over the past 15 years, American agriculture had become increasingly export-oriented, especially to countries such as Canada, Mexico, and South Korea. More than 30% of all American milk produced in border states was shipped to Canada. For grain crops, this figure reached 18%. When one of these markets was closed, the chain collapsed. This was particularly acute in Iowa, where farmers lost access to logistics corridors. Passing through the Great Lakes, now these routes are simply empty.
Well, I think the devil really is in the detail, because it appears that the Trump administration has actually reached agreements with perhaps only about a dozen countries so far and the EU. And of those agreements, only one.
The government tried to intervene quickly. Emergency subsidies of $1.2 billion were announced, tax breaks for farmers were promised, and special purchases of products for state reserves were made. But there was catastrophically little time. Most of these measures took effect with a delay, and administrative barriers made access to aid difficult. One Minnesota farmer told a local TV station, "Bureaucracy moves at a snail's pace when we're already drowning."
We would be ready to negotiate after the election, which are basically in less than 3 weeks. At the same time, we want to make sure that we can negotiate not only on trade, but also on security. And we need a full partnership. But at the end of the day, what we know, Jake, is the relationship between Canada and the US will never be the same.
Meanwhile, something strange was happening in Canada itself. The Trudeau government assured that the law was passed solely in the interests of Canadian producers. However, in the same month, an expanded trade agreement was signed with New Zealand, giving preferences for the supply of dairy products and lamb meat. American experts immediately spoke of a political maneuver aimed at redistributing markets in favor of countries more loyal to Canada's current foreign policy. This sparked a wave of outrage in the media. As it turned out, the US had fallen victim to a geopolitical deal that no one had even suspected.
It's been amazing what's happened. Sometimes you have to mix it up a little bit.
Against this backdrop, new alarming data emerged. One of the confidential analytical notes leaked to the press contained a forecast. If the export ban remains in place until the end of the second quarter of 2025, the total losses of the US agricultural sector will exceed $47 billion. This means not only job losses, but also the bankruptcy of tens of thousands of farms, a reduction in food supplies to the domestic market, and thus a potential increase in prices for American consumers as early as this fall.
Is the president operating on any sort of a timeline or deadline where he wants this completed by?
Well, we always move at Trump speed here at the White House, which is incredibly fast. All options are on the table for each country, but again, these are going to be tailor-made deals. They are not going to be off-the-rack deals, as the president has called it.
Thus, we are witnessing the beginning of a major shift in U.S. agricultural policy. The familiar model of produce, export, maintain balance has failed. One law, one signature by the prime minister of a neighboring state, and the entire system is under threat. Farmers, suppliers, distributors, and ordinary workers who depend on processing plants are not just counting their losses today. They are asking themselves, what next?
The first deal that was struck, that with the UK, has actually been signed. So there is a lot of detail still to be worked out here, Taig, and the devil very much in the detail potentially, because we have still, of course, agreements to be reached with
And if Washington does not come up with a coordinated response in the coming weeks, not only economic, but also diplomatic, then the blow dealt by Bill 202 may not be an episode, but a turning point. The very one after which American agriculture will never be the same again. While the consequences of Canada's Bill C-202 have hit the entire U.S. agricultural system in Wisconsin, Minnesota, New York, and Michigan, the blow has been devastating. Here, where agriculture is not just an economic sector but part of the regional culture, tradition, and identity, everything began to collapse rapidly, almost as if according to a pre-calculated scenario. The situation became particularly acute in Wisconsin, a state that many rightly call the cheese capital of America. Before the crisis, about 14% of the country's total dairy production was produced here, and half of that volume was exported, primarily to Canada. After the law came into force, this supply chain was broken, and in just 10 days, more than 15 million liters of milk remained unsold. Farmers began pouring milk onto their fields not as a protest, but simply because they had nowhere else to put it. Processing equipment was overloaded, tanks were full, and logistics failed. Despair quickly turned to anger. The state's largest dairy cooperatives, Dairy Union Midwest and Farmers Blend Company, filed a class action lawsuit against the federal government, accusing it of inaction and unpreparedness for the trade crisis. Thousands of people took to the streets of Madison to protest, including not only farmers, but also processors, suppliers, and freight carriers, the entire agricultural cluster of the state. They demanded the introduction of temporary purchasing interventions, direct financial assistance, and the immediate launch of a mechanism to reorient to other export markets. However, time was against them. According to the most conservative estimates, losses in Wisconsin exceeded $470 million in the first 3 weeks. An equally dramatic situation unfolded in Minnesota. This state is not as well known for its dairy industry as Wisconsin, but its contribution to grain exports is one of the highest in the country. Before the trade strike, Canada purchased up to 23% of Minnesota's grain, including corn, soybeans, and wheat. After the northern route was closed, huge volumes of products began to accumulate in warehouses and elevators. One of the state's largest grain terminals, Iron Bend Logistics Hub, had to temporarily suspend operations. There was simply nowhere to unload the arriving trains. According to official data, corn prices in the region fell by 27%, soybeans fell by 25%, and shipments to China and South Korea were disrupted due to a lack of available transport corridors. Everything was tied to existing routes through Canada.
Well, you know, for the businesses and exporters, there is still a sense of uncertainty. They are on the edge. They don't know where they stand. So the 25% tariff for now stays, but there is also, the Trump's statement that there will be an additional penalty for India buying Russian oil and arms, and how that translates, whether it will be an additional tariff or would be that penalty would come in some other form.
At the same time, the infrastructure began to collapse. About 70 grain processing plants across Minnesota reduced their workload or closed. Workers were sent on forced leave, many of them without pay. In Redwood County, there was a 48% increase in unemployment benefit claims in just 1 month. Those laid off included not only seasonal workers but also engineers, logisticians, drivers, and technicians. The labor market contracted so sharply that by the end of March, some schools in rural areas began switching to a 3-day school week due to a lack of funding. But perhaps the most painful situation was in New York. Despite its urban reputation, this state has historically played a key role in the dairy industry. The northern part of the state is home to hundreds of farms, cooperatives, and small processing plants that serve both the domestic market and international supply chains. After C-202 came into effect, exports of American milk and dairy products to Canada virtually stopped. This resulted in a large-scale overproduction trap. Farmers continued to milk cows, warehouses were filled to capacity, and processing came to a halt. Within a month, the price of milk in the state fell by 21%, which meant that many farms were operating at a loss.
So we're in a campaign right now. The elections in Canada are on April 28th. The Prime Minister Carney, and President Trump had a first phone call. We said that
small and medium-sized farms, family farms that had been in operation for 2 or 3 generations, were particularly hard hit. One of the most high-profile cases occurred in the St. Lawrence Valley, where 5 cooperatives representing nearly 600 families declared bankruptcy and sold their equipment to Kansas, hoping to move and start over. These people did not just lose their businesses, they lost their land, their cows, their homes, and their family histories. Some farmers from the state appealed directly to the Canadian authorities, proposing the creation of exemptions or humanitarian quotas for dairy products, but their appeals went unanswered. Meanwhile, the situation in Michigan took a special turn. In addition to being heavily dependent on soybean and corn exports, the state also serves as a logistics hub for agricultural shipments to the Northeast. After the trade collapse, dozens of logistics companies faced a wave of cancelled orders. One of the largest agricultural transporters, Michigan FarmTrans, announced a 40% reduction in its workforce, explaining that it was due to a complete loss of business to Canada. Warehouses in the Detroit area were overflowing. Dairy and grain products sat idle for weeks. Power grids connected to processing plants began to experience abnormal load fluctuations, which, according to any company representatives, already threatens to cause outages in neighboring areas. Against this backdrop, the federal authorities found themselves in a difficult position. Under pressure from the farming lobby, an emergency package of measures was put together: temporary compensation for losses, expansion of the government procurement program, and tax breaks. However, local farmers openly said that all this was just a band-aid on a sinking ship. Confidential analytical materials were leaked to the press, according to which by the middle of the second quarter, the cumulative losses of these 4 states alone could reach $16.8 billion. The problem is that the affected industries cannot simply switch to another market. Contracts with Europe require months of certification. Asia is limited by logistics. South America is overloaded with its own exports. All this means one thing: the decision taken in Ottawa has effectively paralyzed a powerful segment of the US economy, depriving millions of people not only of income, but also of confidence in the future.
Yes, it's been a very tense time for the manufacturers here, Tig, because Thailand was slow to get its negotiations going.
Now Wisconsin, Minnesota, New York, and Michigan have become more than just hotbeds of the agricultural crisis. They are symbols of how devastating the consequences of foreign policy decisions can be for the domestic market. And if a solution is not found urgently, these regions may go down in history as the first in a series of collapses that will cause the entire American agricultural framework to crumble. If the crisis triggered by Canada's Bill C-202 swept through the central and northeastern states of the US with a powerful but expected wave, then in North Dakota, California, and Iowa, it has taken the form of an uncontrolled funnel that is pulling in more and more layers of the economy every day. Here, in the heart of America's agro-industrial power, the effect has been not only devastating but also systemic. What looked like a serious blow in Wisconsin and Minnesota turned into a real threat to the country's food and energy security in these regions.
The key trading partner, China, which, of course, at one stage the United States was threatening to impose tariffs of 145% on. Well, since then, there's been a trade negotiation truce, if you like. Those negotiations, key negotiations, due to continue in a few weeks' time.
North Dakota, one of the most agrarian and energy-rich states in the US, felt confident until the beginning of 2025. Vast areas of arable land, a strong grain base, stable supplies of corn and wheat for export, plus a parallel oil industry, all this made the region's economy stable. But in the new reality, it turned out that 62% of all grain exports from the state went through northern border terminals, including through Canadian logistics. When these channels were blocked, the market collapsed almost instantly. In the first 4 weeks after the enactment of Bill C-202, wheat prices fell by 26%, corn lost 24% of its value, and total exports fell by 71%.